Introduction, Dermographies by Sarah Ahmad and Jackie Stacy. Why should our bodies end at the skin or include at best other beings encapsulated by skin? Donna Haraway. This book takes the skin not only as its object, but as a point of departure for a different way of thinking. We seek to think about the skin, but also to think with or through the skin. Such an approach engenders a way of thinking that attends to the forms and folds of living skin, at the same time as it takes the shape of such skin as it forms and reforms, unfolds and refolds. Whilst this collection stages an intimate dialogue with the growing feminist literature on lived and imagined embodiment, it avoids taking the body as its privileged feature. Instead, it focuses on the skin as the outer covering of the body that both protects us from others and exposes us to them. In making the shift, we call for a skin-tight politics, a politics that takes as its orientation not the body as such, but the fleshy interface between bodies and worlds. Thinking through the skin is a thinking that reflects not on the body as the lost object of thought, but on inter-embodiment, on the mode of being with and being for, where one touches and is touched by others. Thinking through the skin poses the question of how skin becomes, rather than simply is, meaningful. To ask such a question is to suggest that the skin is always open to being read. If the skin is always open to being read, and being read differently, we can also consider the ways in which these various techniques for reading produce skins in specific and determinate ways. For example, in consumer culture we are encouraged to read skin, especially feminine skin, as something that needs to be worked upon in order to be protected from the passage of time or the severity of the external world, and in order to retain its marker of gender difference in the softness of its feel. We may be encouraged to fear skin conditions and to use creams to prevent the signs of aging from appearing on our skins. We may worry about the stretch marks that tear through the skin, both an affect and sign of the expansion and contraction of our bodily forms, as Imogen Tyler discusses in her chapter on pregnant embodiment. Or, as Tina Takamoto suggests in her chapter, we may feel pressure to cover the traces of illness and surgery, succumbing to or resisting the shame of their bodily evidence. Or indeed, as Jay Prosser explores in his chapter on skin autobiographies, we may dread the diseases in which the skin falls away, revealing the subject's vulnerability to external scrutiny. Despite this apparently ubiquitous desire for smooth skin, the skin is also subject to many forms of assault in contemporary culture, as Stephen Connor suggests in his chapter, The Skin Surface, as the bearer or scene of meaning is pierced, cut, and tattooed. Indeed, skin surfaces will always fail to be smooth, whether that failure is dependent upon the deliberate markings of skin, or upon the unwanted traces of bodily changes or medical intervention, or upon the impossible desires produced by consumer culture. As Anne McClintock has demonstrated, the imperative of consumption is to work towards smooth and shiny surfaces that conceal the signs of labor as well as time. Importantly, the desire for smooth skin requires that skin surfaces are not smooth in the present. The marking of the skin is linked to both its temporal and spatial dimensions. Skin is temporal in the sense that it is affected by the passing of time, or, to put it differently, it materializes that passing in the accumulation of marks of wrinkles, lines, and creases, as well as in the literal disintegration of skin. As Penelope Duscher's chapter suggests, we are invited to see the marks on the body as signs of aging, as the tear of time. Furthermore, as Jay Prosser argues in his contribution, Skin Remembers, skin surfaces record our personal biographies, however imperfectly. The skin is also spatial, in the sense that it expands and contracts. Indeed, the skin as bodyscape is inhabited by, as well as inhabiting, the space of the nation and the landscape, as Chantal Naudou and Jennifer Biddle suggest in their chapters. As a result, the skin is not simply in the present, in the here or the now. Insofar as it has multiple histories and unimaginable futures, it is worked upon, and indeed, it is worked towards. As a way of thinking through the skin, we ask, how does the skin come to be written and narrated? How is the skin managed by subjects, others, and nations? We examine the different technologies of the skin and how particular discourses, medical, scientific, aesthetic, intersect to produce the intelligible skin, even when the skin cannot be held in place by such knowledges. This book hence draws on multiple theoretical and disciplinary paradigms to consider how the skin is lived, read, written, narrated, seen, touched, managed, worked, cut, remembered, produced, and known. These diverse approaches to thinking about the skin as a boundary object and as the site of exposure or connectedness invite the reader to consider how the borders between bodies are unstable and how such borders are already crossed by differences that refuse to be contained on the inside or the outside of bodies. Thinking Bodies. Our title clearly references Jane Gallup's book, Thinking Through the Body, which represents one of the many important feminist contributions to theorizing embodiment. As her title indicates, Gallup's intervention demonstrated that the body, which has been read by traditional philosophy as mere and brute matter, remains to be thought. Here, bodies are no longer assumed simply to be given and into the world, but are rather understood as both the locus of thinking, the site from which thinking takes place, and as the object of thought, as being already subject to interpretation and conceptualization. As Elizabeth Scarry has shown in The Body in Pain, the interfaces between bodies and their worlds are made and unmade through social practices, the pain of which may shatter language and defy its representational potential. Thus, the practices of thinking are not separated from the realm of the body, but are implicated in the passion, emotions, and materiality that are associated with lived embodiment. The task of thinking through the skin is, at one level, to continue the feminist project of taking bodies seriously as both the subject and object of thinking. Certainly, with recent feminist theory, bodies have become a privileged focus of attention. This can partly be explained by the feminist recognition that women's marginalization from philosophical discourses and the public sphere has been produced through the association between masculinity and reason and femininity and the body. The feminist concern with revaluing the body and undermining such mind-body dualism has led to the acknowledgement that bodies are not simply given as nature, that bodies are differentiated, and that subjectivity and identity cannot be separated from specific forms of embodiment. An approach which refuses to privilege mind over body, and which assumes that the body cannot be transcended, is one which thus emphasizes contingency, locatedness, the irreducibility of difference, the passage of emotions and desire, and the worldliness of being. Although Thinking Through the Skin will be read as a contribution to feminist theories of embodiment, it also seeks to provide a critique of how the body can become a privileged object within feminist theory. For in some sense, the very argument that the body has been elided, negated, and devalued in masculinist thought can fetishize the body, can allow it to appear as if it is an object that could simply be missing. In Thinking Through the Skin, we do not assume that we can find difference simply through evoking the lost object of the body. What is required, we suggest, is a recognition of the function of social differences in establishing the very boundaries which appear to mark out the body. Otherwise, we are in danger of fetishizing the body by assuming that it contains these differences within the singularity of its figure. In order to address the question of embodiment without fetishizing the body as the lost object, this book calls for us to think instead through the skin. This is not to replace one fetish with another, the body with the skin, but rather we seek to interrogate how the skin is attributed a meaning and logic of its own. The task of the book is thus in part to think through how the skin acquires the status of a fetish, that is, how the skin is assumed to contain either the body, identity, well-being, or value. It is the fetishizing of the skin as boundary object that allows the contours of the body to appear as a given. In Shirley Tate's chapter, for example, there is an analysis of how racial differences are read on or even off the surface of the skin color. Tate examines how processes of abjection, the expulsion of what is undesirable from the body, see Kristeva on objection, serve to constitute and transgress the skin as a boundary in the encounters with black others who are already associated with skin and seen as the cause of abjection. Furthermore, as Takimoto suggests in her contribution, we often wrongly assume we can know another through the sight of the skin and through its marking. In other words, not only is skin assumed to be a sign of the subject's interiority, for example, what it means to be white or black, ill or well, but the skin is also assumed to reflect the truth of the other and to give us access to the other's being. As these contributions suggest, the skin is fetishized as a boundary object by a variety of different and overlapping discourses, which measure the truth, health, or nature of bodies through the skin. It is one of the tasks of this book to account for the cultural function of this skin fetishism. Insofar as we frame this book around the social and cultural production of the skin, we follow the work of Elizabeth Gross, Rosie Braidotti, and Judith Butler. In Gross's Volatile Bodies, the challenge to mind-body dualism also challenges the surface-depth model of subjectivity. For Gross, following from Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, embodiment involves the intensity of desires and flows which themselves produce the effect of depth or interiority. In Rosi Braidotti's work, also in dialogue with Deleuze and Guattari, the body is understood in terms of folding. It is a folding in of external influences and a simultaneous unfolding outwards of effects. For Judith Butler, taking a different route through Foucault and Lacan, the materialization of the body is defined as an effect of boundary, surface, and fixity. Gross, Braidotti, and Butler have shown that challenging the mind-body dualism also requires a rethinking of the relationship between depth and surface, between inside and outside, and between self and other. To this extent, these writers all refuse to take the contours or boundaries of the body for granted. They refuse to simply inhabit the skin or to assume that the skin cloaks the body. Hence, we can read their work as contributing to a feminist philosophy of skin. This is not to suggest that skin is their object, but rather that we can understand their work on embodiment as a rethinking of how skin comes to materialize in the forms that it does, at the same time as they show how skins, as well as other bodily surfaces and folds, expose bodies to other bodies, rather than simply containing the body as such. Interembodiment. As well as seeking to challenge the long-standing traditions of thinking that have denigrated the body in favor of the mind, feminist and other critical work on embodiment has also emerged as a response to the disembodying models of power and subjectivity brought center stage by the impact of dominant models of structuralism and post-structuralism, which place language both literally and metonymically at the center of theories of culture. Whilst welcoming the ways in which these models dislodge some of the problematic economic and technological determinism of many Marxist understandings of culture, some feminist writers have remained highly critical of the subjects without bodies, so many of these theories posited. Whilst much feminist work on embodiment continues numerous dialogues with these theoretical frameworks, the proliferation of writing on the body nevertheless testifies to a frustration with their refusal to address how subjectivities are necessarily embodied. Two recent turns are indicative of the desire for an increasingly located and indeed fleshy body. First, feminists have turned to Maurice Merleau-Ponty for a phenomenological account of interembodiment. For example, Gail Weiss has offered an exploration of the relationships between body images, imaginary morphologies, and materializations. Her approach stresses the significance of Merleau-Ponty's notion of intercorporeality. To describe embodiment as intercorporeality is to emphasize that the experience of being embodied is never a private affair, but is always already mediated by our continual interactions with other human and non-human bodies. In Merleau-Ponty's work, there is an emphasis on embodiment not only as fleshy and material, but also as worldly, as being in an intimate and living relationship to the world, which is a world made up of other bodies. Given his focus on the experiential, Merleau-Ponty's work attends to the multiplicity of sense perceptions. Bodies can be touched as well as seen. Following from Merleau-Ponty and Catherine Vassalou, Claudia Castaneda's contribution to this collection attends to the relationship between touch and the sociality of embodiment. One is always touched by others, not all of whom are necessarily human. Merleau-Ponty theorizes the fleshiness of such intercorporeality through considering the concept of the reversibility of touch. While each monocular vision, each touching with one sole hand has its own visible, its tactile, each is bound to every other vision, to every other touch, it is bound in such a way as to make up with them the experience of one sole body before one sole world, through a possibility for reversion, reconversion of its language into theirs, transfer and reversal. Now why would this generality, which constitutes the unity of my body, not open it to other bodies? The handshake too is reversible. I can feel myself touched as well and at the same time as touching. For Merleau-Ponty, the very experiences which make the body my body, as if it were a soul body before a soul world, are the very same experiences which open my body to other bodies in the simultaneous mutuality of touch and being touched, and seeing and being seen. In this sense, my body does not belong to me. Embodiment is what opens out the intimacy of myself with others. The relationship between bodies is characterized by a with that precedes or is the condition of possibility for the apartness of my body. This with is the fleshiness of the world which inhabits us and is inhabited by us, flesh not understood simply as matter, but as the very sensibility of the seen and the very sight of the sensible. Indeed, in Penelope Duscher's contribution to this volume, it is the erotics of tactile encounters that open up a different way of thinking the body. Skin opens our bodies to other bodies. Through touch, the separation of self and other is undermined in the very intimacy or proximity of the encounter. However, for feminist, queer, and post-colonial critics, there remain the troubling questions. If one is always with other bodies in a fleshy sociality, then how are we with others differently? How does this inter-embodiment involve the social differentiation between bodily others? For example, in her recent book, The Skin of the Film, Intercultural Cinema, Embodiment, and the Senses, Laura Marks draws on phenomenology and Deleuzian theory to explore an embodied model of cinematic spectatorship. See also Sobchak, that places cultural difference center stage. The image that evokes a sensual memory of lost loved ones, people, places, homes, operates through a distinctive visual register of touch, what Marx calls a haptic visuality. Marx uses this notion of haptic visuality to explore the relationships of present, absent, and remembered bodies and places in the category of intercultural cinema, a group of films and videos which interrogate the political issues of displacement and hybridity. For Marx, whereas the dominant mode of optic visuality sees things from enough distance to perceive them as distinct forms in deep space, and depends on a separation between the viewing subject and the object, in contrast, haptic visuality refers to the way in which the eyes themselves function like organs of touch. Rather than plunging the depth of the object, haptic looking moves over the surface, according to Marx, not to distinguish form so much as to discern texture. Thus, the tactility of the image, the ways that spectators might touch the film with their eyes, is intimately bound up with the differential effects of diasporic culture in which the sometimes traumatic interrogation of personal and family memories only creates an empty space where no history is certain. Similarly, forms and processes of cultural differentiation are central to the way this book explores how bodies are with other bodies. Feminists and other theorists have criticized the universalism of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of the body and have tried to examine how bodies may be lived differently. For example, in her chapter in this volume, Jennifer Biddle considers how bodies are differentiated from each other, but not simply through the marking of the skin. And Margaret Shildrick's contribution seeks to think through the specificity of the embodiment of conjoined twins without assuming we can access the truth of their lived embodiment. As she suggests, to say that there are bodies that are marked as different from the normalized body is not to assume that we can know what that body is or how it feels to inhabit it. So, while many of these chapters follow from the phenomenological emphasis on lived, felt intercorporeality, they also suggest that such intercorporeality is subject to forms of social differentiation, although such differences cannot simply be found on the bodies of those who are marked. Several chapters in this book think of skin as a border, but as a border that feels, and yet the skin is not like a mirror. It does not reflect the truth of the inner self, despite our desires to the contrary. Skin lacks the depth, the interiority we want it to give us. So although skin may have a testimonial function, the act of bearing witness to trauma, injustice, violence, and the pain of others cannot involve simply the transformation of skin into voice, as Jane Kilby demonstrates in her chapter. While the nearness of others is always felt on the skin, that nearness also involves distance, or the impossibility of getting inside the other's skin.